Hi, my name is Jake. Welcome to Canadian Cutting Edge University, and this is my fake fireplace behind me. It used to be a real fireplace, but it's converted to electric now, and we use it 1 or 2 days a year. But it looks nice. We're going to do a little lecture today about the different types of knives that are out there. The blade shapes is the basic thing we're focusing on. We're not talking about the grinds, like hollow grinds and flat grinds and saber grinds and what have you. Just the basic shape of the blade. And that's what we're going to cover. We're not going to go into very deep detail. There are dozens and dozens, maybe even dozens and dozens and dozens of types of blade shapes that are out there, combinations of blade shapes that they put together. I'm just going to cover what I think are the most basic blade shapes that are out there. Most of these are used in folding knives. But then again, you can get a folding knife with any shape of blade, but the most common ones, and maybe a few, are more used for fixed blades. But without further ado, grab yourself a coffee or a drink, another kind of drink, maybe a sandwich or something. This video might be a little longer than my usual ones. I suspect it will be. But stick around. I'll try to be brief and concise. We'll see you at the tabletop. Coming to you right now. First off, I put this in the corner just because a number of my videos are starting to get ripped off, especially the CCEU ones. So that's a little harder for them to remove if it's actually in the image. And the other thing I'm going to talk about is I'm not going to name every single knife, give you the model number and information. That would make a very, very long video. And first off, the most common, in my opinion, blade shape is the drop point blade. What's a drop point blade? It's a blade that has a curved spine. So I'm assuming you know some basic technology about knives. This is the spine of the blade. It's curved down towards the tip. Now, it doesn't matter what happens over here. It's just coming down towards the tip. So this is a fixed blade of that style. You can get it with a swedge on the blade if you want to. That doesn't make any difference. That's just a slight removal of a grind, sort of like a bevel, but it doesn't come to a cutting edge. It's got a flat spine there. And so, yeah, this one's got a recurve back here. That doesn't make a difference. We're talking about the shape of the blade, especially the spine coming down. A very common knife that's got a drop point is this knife. This is the Ontario Rat. Now, a lot of people don't think that it's a drop point, but it is. It's slowly curving down. This is not a straight line. It's a curved line coming down. So I would call that a drop point. So it features a slight curve on the spine coming down towards the tip. That's the main thing. Why is it the most common type of knife? Well, it's because it's probably the most useful type of knife. This knife can be used for just about anything that you need to do. For piercing stuff, yeah, drop points can usually do that. For slicing things, very often they're very good for that. For any kind of cutting, a slicing action or straight down cutting action, it's just a very, very versatile blade type that is strong, so it keeps the strength if they don't come too thin towards the tip. It's very strong, very usable. If all the world's knives were drop point blades, I think we could still get 99% of our jobs done. It's that good of a style because, like I'm showing, you can do different things with a drop point and still have them be called drop point blades. Even this one, it's got a slight drop to it. So there you go. That's the most common type of blade. What are the cons for this type of blade? Well, I'm not really sure what the cons are. It's a good blade style. The one biggest con might be it doesn't have a lot of flash or panache. It's just a basic good-looking knife. The drop point blade gets the panache from other things on it. On the knife, maybe the handle, maybe some other features or whatever, or maybe, the bevel or the cutting edge shape, all kinds of things. Like I said, this is just a brief introduction. It's not going into big details. If you want to ask questions, ask them down below. I will try to answer them. So there you go. That's the first one. The second blade type I want to talk about is the straight back or standard. This is the old style of knife. This is what used to be made because, very often if you're cutting out steel, especially in years gone by, it was easiest to cut a straight edge and then they would make the bevel. and the main grind. Well, these straight edge back, you can have a hollow grind or a flat grind or recurve, whatever you want. It's just that this spine here is straight. It's usually in line with the handle, like this knife that I just reviewed yesterday. It is September the 3rd today. So I made the review yesterday, but it went live on September 3rd. Here's another knife that's got a straight back, but it's got a swedge over here on the back of the spine there. And basically in line with the handle. Of course, the handle's got a change back here. I still have to review this guy. What is so good about having a straight back knife? Well, there's nothing more special necessarily. It's usually a kind of knife that's very good for chopping and slicing. It's good for putting spine pressure on because it's usually straight. Very often it does not have a swedge, and so very often it's thicker as well. You can put your fingers on it anywhere and get more delicate purchase wherever you want to on the blade, even up close to the tip. Not saying you can't do that with other knives, but straight back blade is very good for that kind of thing. The spine is flat, and the main section here is flat, and it's not sharpened. So it's a sturdy knife. Often these kinds of knives are a little bit heavier because steel that could have been removed hasn't been removed. It all depends on the styling of how they do it. You can get really big straight back fixed blades that are used for chopping. Even some machetes are made that way. Condor knives, they often have straight back knives. Big heavy knives, and they're just very effective. They're old school and they work. I'd like to see more straight back knives, to be honest with you, because it's something that's not super popular these days. There are a lot of straight back knives that people think are straight backs, and then when they put it down on a flat surface and they go to rock it, if my hand was flat, they would find that it's actually got a curve to it, ever so slightly. There's a lot of knives that have a very slight curve. So what do? Do you call it a straight back? Well, it all depends. I'm of the opinion that there aren't very distinct black and white categories for most of these. There's little edges to them, and that's why we've got dozens and dozens and dozens of types of knives out there, because there's nuances that you can do to every single one of them, and just a very slight change. Does it make it a totally different kind of knife, or is it just that kind of knife with a slight flare or something? We've got to keep going for time's sake. I'm going to do another video on cutting edges, so stay tuned to the channel for that. I'm not sure how long it will take to do that. Like serrated or saber, Scandinavian, hollow grind, recurve, all sorts. That'll be a different video. This is blade shapes. What's the third most common? I should say in 2020, the straight back is not all that common, but the next knife that we're going to look at is very common, the clip point. And the clip point is a knife that's got generally a straight spine, and then it's got a section of metal clipped away. Very often it'll have a swedge on it, like this knife right here. This is one of the most popular knives in the world right now, the Buck 110. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to name them all, but there you go. And then very often it's got a nice belly and often a straight edge. Another similar one is this knife right here by Civivi, and it's got the same kind of thing, but this is slightly upswept here, not exactly flat with the spine. Then we got a bit of a swedge, and it's got a clip point. Now the clip point on these two are both curved. There's a radius there. It doesn't have to have that kind of radius and still be a clip point. It can just be clipped off like that. So there's a lot of different clip point knives out there. It's very, very popular. One of the things that it's very useful for is a precision tip. So the tip can be used for piercing, like leather. Bowie, who the knife's named after, used it as a fighting knife. There's all kinds of purposes you can use a clip point for. It can be used to reach places that are harder to reach otherwise. When it's for the length of the knife, it's fairly narrow this way. Then it's used to get into places for doing more precise work. But you can have clip point blades that are deeper as well. And then the clip point still can't reach super far, but there you go. It's not meant for super heavy duty tasks. This is on a fixed blade, and on a fixed blade here with a clip point handy. So it's not usually used like for batoning. Like imagine this is a fixed blade and it's like 3 times the length. it's generally not used to baton with because you're going to break your baton board on the edge here, and you might hurt the knife too. It's a very useful knife. It's got a lot of good uses, and it's got a good look. A lot of people like the look of the clip point blade. If I'm not going in depth enough for you, I'm sorry, because this is just a general thing. I would have to do a whole, like maybe a 20-minute video per, blade style in order to really get the good points out of it and the nuances. I'm just basically covering these partially for identification purposes and partially for introduction. Let's keep going to the next one. And now we have the tanto. Here's a Western style tanto blade, especially if you're looking at the end of the blade right there. That's a common version of a Western style tanto, but it doesn't have to be exactly like this. The main feature of a Western tanto as opposed to a original tanto, a Japanese tanto, is this edge right here. On a Western tanto, it almost always is the fact, and this is one of those anomalies in my video, it's not as much about the spine of the blade as it is about the cutting edges, where there's, from the handle going outwards, there's a flat cutting edge, and then there's an angle change going up and away, and that's flat as well. And that's a Western tanto shape. This one, it's mixed with a drop point, but it's basically a Western tanto. Now, the angle that you put on this tanto leading edge, well, it varies depending on how they want to make the knife. That's why there's dozens and dozens of types of knives. But that's it. The main things are Western tantos and Japanese tantos. Japanese ones came first from, the samurai sword. That's where the tanto, that's the epitome of a Japanese tanto blade. But even the Japanese sometimes do other things, but usually a Japanese tanto is more like this knife. And I still have to review this guy. Straight edge here, but then this part of the tanto is curved. So this is a better slicing edge. Now, it doesn't have to be this long to be a tanto. The ratios aren't, how long this edge is compared to this one, where this one's longer than this one is now. But just imagine, if this wasn't a handle, but this part right here just kept going and going and going. And then this would look smaller, and then you'd get an idea of the difference. So Japanese tanto, curved first edge. Western tanto, straight first edge. And of course, there's lots of variabilities. I'm not a person who uses the term reverse tanto. I don't like that term at all. Very often it's used on knives like this one here. Even if it's got a straight edge first and then it's got this clip on it, just imagine this is straight and it doesn't have this belly here. So imagine that it's cut off right there. Well, then they're going to call that a Wharncliffe, right? I'm not going to say they're wrong. It's just I don't use that term. I call this either a spade tip blade or a clip point blade because it clipped off the end. So you decide what you want to call it. I'm just telling you the way I call it when I do my reviews. This is not a reverse tanto, in my opinion. And sure, you can say I'm wrong. That's just fine. It doesn't make a difference to me one way or another because I'm just describing to you the way I call these knives. Let me say it this way. I know there's a lot of guys, especially guys, who like to say that this is this, is this, is this, and everything's black and white, and there's very distinct categories between everything, and they're always right, of course. I make a lot of mistakes, and I try to fess up to them, especially when they're pointed out to me and I find out about them. But I think things are more fluid than that. There's nuances to things, and that's why I've chosen to not believe in a reverse tanto. Whenever I look at one of those, it looks more like a clip point blade to me. It's just clipped at the tip like a spade point blade, which is another version of a clip point blade. And since I just talked about it, I'm not going to do another section about it, but the original spade blades were like this. Yeah, it doesn't look that much different than the knife I just showed you. And the purpose for these knives is so they'd be more difficult to pierce because they were used to spay animals on ranches and farms. To spay means to remove the testicles. I didn't cover what this tip is useful for. Tanto, The power and everything is in the tip, and generally it's designed for piercing extremely efficiently without being delicate at the tip. So see how thick this knife is? The blade thickness stays all the way along. Well, it looks different because it's sort of wedged, but the thickness stays all the way along till right close to the tip so that it's very strong to pierce into just about anything. And that's because this is a very durable tip, generally speaking. It's not an absolute, just generally speaking. Okay, now let's go on to the next one. Well, now I'm going to cover actually two types at the same time. So this section might be a little bit longer. And this is Wharncliffe sheepsfoot. Which is which? And how can you tell the difference? And what are they good for and stuff? Here's a Wharncliffe blade. Now, the main distinction between a Wharncliffe blade and a sheepsfoot blade is the style of cutting edge. So this cutting edge is basically flat. Yes, there's a very tiny belly on this one, but it's basically a flat edge, and then it's got a nose to it that comes back. So it's fairly blunt. Sheepsfoot is similar, except for it's got a curved cutting edge, and then it comes down. Now, sheepsfoot and Wharncliffe both can have, this edge take a long time to come back. Like this knife here, I still have to review this guy, so don't go looking for it yet. It comes back a long ways while the curve keeps coming until you're fairly close to the handle. Whereas on this Wharncliffe, it's curved, and then it's flat for a long time before it gets to the handle. Now, it doesn't have to be a curve on the Wharncliffe, and generally not on the sheepsfoot either. It could be fairly straight as well. So you can have a long Wharncliffe, or you can have a blunt Wharncliffe. See, this Wharncliffe is not good for piercing, but you could have Wharncliffes that are okay for piercing. But it's mostly about this edge is straight, and then it comes down to meet the point. How much different is that from a drop point? You tell me. It is different from a drop point, but it's not totally different, is it? Nuances again. So Wharncliffe, generally speaking, sheepsfoot. What do you call this one? Well, this would be a sheepsfoot, generally speaking. And yet you can see that you could pierce into some things with that tip, but you certainly wouldn't make holes in leather with it because their holes would be very wide and unruly, especially something with this. Yeah, it's just not for that kind of thing. What are the Wharncliffes and sheepfoots generally for? They're generally robust knives because they keep a lot of thickness close to the tip. Like the spine tends to come out a long ways. And it generally has a shorter grind if it's a hollow grind, and has the full thickness of the spine generally going fairly close to the tip before it ends. And so they're durability kind of knives. These are tough knives, generally speaking. There's no absolutes here, guys. Workhorse kind of blade style. Both the Wharncliffe and the sheepsfoot, they are really separate, but they're so close, I put them together for this thing. The next style we're going to talk about is the trailing blade. I don't have a lot of trailing blade knives. I reviewed this knife recently. A trailing blade is if you put the handle flat, horizontal, like a straight line across, and I'm just going to use this edge for that, for ignoring the rest of the knife. So if we draw a line straight across the screen for this section, see how the blade comes up, trailing point. Usually trailing points, or not usually, very often trailing points are flat grinds of some kind, either saber or very often a full flat grind. And, they sweep up and away. Sometimes they've got swedges on them. This one doesn't have any swedge here, but sometimes they'll have swedges on them. You've probably seen a lot of swords, cavalry swords, or different types of swords from different countries where they've got an extreme curve that goes up and away. That's the trailing point. What's so good about a trailing point blade? Well, it looks cool, but how is it useful? It usually has a fairly thin tip, so it's very good for piercing, generally speaking. And since it's got a long, curved cutting edge, rounded along, it's great for slicing action. So if you need to do a lot of slicing, you've got a big curved blade like that and a tip like that. Skinning knives very often have this long curved edge here, but they might not be a trailing point. They may or may not be. Often they are, not necessarily. Well, let's go to the next blade style. So on this one, I'm going to put two together again. First is the hawkbill. This is a carpet knife, but you can very, very clearly see the main characteristic of a hawkbill. It's basically the opposite of a trailing point. So instead of this edge being sharpened, it's the spine, and you flip it over, and now it's all recurve coming down to a tip. So what's that good for? Well, it's really good for cutting into things where you have to do a pole kind of cut, and especially if the material is a little bit thicker, because all this cutting edge here, it compresses what you're cutting and forces it into the cutting edge, and it works very, very well. It can also be used if it's small. If you need to do precision work for something, you wouldn't hold this one like this, but that kind of tip with a curved radius here, recurve they call it, it's very good for that. So that's a Talon. Now, a Talon that I really, really like, my favorite Talon knife is this guy. I got it from QSP a little over a year ago when I was at Blade Show 2019. And this is a beautiful knife. So basically, it's a very gentle recurve. So it's still a Talon. It's not as dramatic as that one, but it's a recurve, and then the spine of the blade comes down. Very, very nice. The very, very close sibling to this is the Talon knife. Now, I reviewed a Talon knife recently, and it was the Harn's Beak, simply because you can read it on there. And it's the same knife here with that recurve coming back and the rounded spine, but then you get a belly right here. So you've got a belly and then a recurve, and that's called the Talon. Now you can get some really dramatic Talons. I know that Cold Steel likes to make a lot of Talon blades. Another very common hawkbill style knife is the karambit. It's got a hole in the handle, and it's a fighting knife. So we've got the hawkbill and we've got the Talon. Very similar, slight differences, and they make two groups that I put together. What's next? If you're a Spyderco fan, you're familiar with what is called the leaf shape. This is a real steel knife, and it's sort of a leaf shape. The way I look at the leaf shape, and the description of a leaf shape, is that it looks like this knife. I don't have one of those, that's why I had to see the picture. As you can see in that condor, that if you put the knife down and you drew along the spine and you drew along the cutting edge, and then you flipped it over, it would match up with those lines perfectly. That's a strict definition of a leaf-shaped blade. And this is one case where I like to generally go with a strict definition. So this is not really a leaf-shaped blade. And I don't think that most of Spyderco's knives that they call leaf shape really are leaf shape. They're close. But the most common characteristic, other than being able to draw it and flip it over, is, like you saw in that picture of that other knife, it comes out. If this is the tip, it comes out and then it starts to come back towards the handle. That's the strict definition of what a leaf-shaped blade is. And in this specific case, I'd like to keep it that way. That's just my own personal preference. Your preferences can be different. So a leaf-shaped blade depends on your definition. It might be either very common or quite uncommon. I just wanted to cover it in this video. Next, we've got a blade shape that takes its name after a tool, a harpoon. This is the harpoon shape. Now, generally, the harpoon-shaped blades, and I'd really like to have more of them because I really like them, but I sold them all off a while back when I really needed funds. But generally a harpoon shape, maybe this one's better for describing it, has got a long straight edge, and then it's got a curved point up, but the spine goes up further, and then it's got a cutaway right in that section. So let's see if I can get this close. You can see right there, there's that cutaway, and it comes up to a little, so it comes up, and then you got a little cutaway there. Very often it's for putting finger pressure there while keeping safety so your finger can't slide as easily towards the tip, or your thumb, like on this knife. Both of these are Sanren Muse, by the way. It just gives your thumb some safety in that spot. And very often, like I said, longer straight edge, and then it sweeps up. They very often have swedges, so they look more like a harpoon, like to harpoon a whale, so that it can penetrate easier at the tip. So it's a knife that's designed for penetration, for basic cutting. Now these two are very small, but that gives you an idea of the general shape of a harpoon blade. And now we're going to talk about the spear point blade. Spear point blade is a blade that I don't have one, so let me just bring something out so we can use it to sort of talk about. I'm going to go back to this knife. It's pretty small, but a spear point blade is if this edge and this edge matched each other, especially near the tip. Isn't that a leaf style blade? No, because generally a spear point blade is a weapon against other humans. That's usually the purpose of a spear point blade. Just like a spear tip is the same way, where both edges are the same, and very often, they start at the tip and they come out like that, and then they end at the handle. So a spear point, you often find spear point blades on out the front knives. They're illegal in Canada. I don't have one to show you. And it's basically a weapon. So that's what it's used for super piercing deep into things. Now you can get a spear point blade where it's only got one cutting edge as well. It doesn't have to have two cutting edges. Either way, it can still be a spear point blade. But basically, it's a blade shape, sort of like a leaf shape at the tip, and then often two long straight edges, and it's designed for piercing. We're almost done, and now I'm just going to talk about a few very, very briefly. I've already mentioned the spay point blade, which is often on old style folders like case knives, and the one I showed you before. Another one that's closely related is the pen knife. And so it's very much like a spay point blade, except for it doesn't have a straight clip on the end. It's just basically a small knife. This is a big pen knife, actually, or a little bit big for a pen knife, but I'm using it for demonstration. Like a pen knife is often on these Victorinox knives and other similar types of knives, multi-tool functions usually. And it's a small little blade that has, a drop point and then a bit of a belly and a long straight edge, and it's usually small, and that's why they call it a pen knife. So you'll see a lot of those around. So if you hear the word pen knife, that's what it's talking about. And finally, the last one I want to talk about is the dowel. I'm probably pronouncing that way wrong. And I've got one example, sort of, that I reviewed recently, but I didn't call it that. I called it a sort of a cleaver thing. But this tip part of the blade, that's sort of what a dowel is like. No sharpness here, and generally it comes from more narrow and then going to wider at the tip, like a dowel sword, like this. So this is somewhat close to that, and it's a cool blade shape. In a folding knife, There's no special advantage to that. It just is looking really cool. Oh, that's where I still got some of the residue left from when I measured the grind angle after I finished the recording the rest of the review. But, that's sort of that kind of shape. So generally, there's more weight at the tip, and you've got a long, curved, sharp edge with it. But it's got this sort of radius here at the leading edge. Well, not the leading cutting edge, to go back up to the spine. So that covers basically a lot of the main types of knives. There's a lot of knives that are sort of mixtures of them. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of knives that take multiple things and put them together. What's this? What blade shape is that called? Is it a spay point or is it a clip point? But why is that a negative radius like a Bowie knife? What is that? Well, the thing is, there's a lot of knives that have this kind of shape, especially a number of Benchmade knives, which this is a copy of, essentially. What do you call that? I generally call that probably a clip point blade, but other opinions are just as valid as mine. I'm just showing you some examples of some things that are weird. What's this? Not the handle or anything. Is this a sheepsfoot? Because we've got a round belly and coming up with that, but it's upswept, up and away. Can't be a trailing point because that edge comes down, but it's sort of a... This is a more simple one. I definitely call this a sheepsfoot. What's this? I've reviewed this guy already. Is this a clip point or is it a harpoon, sort of modified harpoon style with this section here? Well, again, generally I'd call it a clip point blade, just to show you that there's all kinds of knives out there, all kinds of different shapes. There are many, many more, all kinds of weird combinations. And if this is the first video of mine that you've ever watched, thank you so very much for watching right to the end. I appreciate it tremendously. Consider subscribing, would you? And like, share, comment. And remember, friends, always cut towards your chum, not your thumb. Bye for now.